Hello and welcome to Daily Prelims Practice, where we take up the questions from the Hindu and Indian Express and curate them as per the demands of Civil Services Prelims examination. The questions for the discussion are listed on your screen. Moving on with the first article of the day, the article has featured on page 12 of the Hindu and basically talks about the Adi Mahotsav and the TRIFED. Now, UPSC under the previous year has asked questions related to various organizations that were related to the communities or the development program initiated under the economic sector, as a question was seen in 2018 regarding APIDA. A practice question on similar lines can be framed in this regard. The practice question here says, with reference to Tribal Cooperative Marketing Federation of India, consider the following statement. The first statement here is, TRIFED was established under the Multi-State Cooperative Society Act. Now this statement is correct. TRIFED basically is a national level apex organization functioning under the administrative control of Ministry of Tribal Affairs. Now this organization was established in 1987 under the Multi-State Cooperative Society Act of 1984. Moving on to the second statement, it says it has institutionalized the trade of surplus agriculture produce cultivated by the tribals. Now this statement is also correct, as the basic mandate of TRIFED when it was set up in 1987 was to bring about socio-economic development of tribals of the country by institutionalizing the trade of minor forest produce and surplus agriculture produce. Moving on to the third statement, it says Tri-Food scheme is launched jointly by TRIFED and Ministry of Commerce and Industry. Now this statement is incorrect, as Tri-Food scheme is a joint initiative of Ministry of Food Processing Industry, Ministry of Tribal Affairs and that of TRIFED. And under this scheme, a tertiary value addition center would be set up. Now going a little deeper about Tri-Food scheme, this scheme is implemented in the backdrop of Bandhan Yojana and will promote value addition to the minor forest produce. The question further says which of the statement given above is or are incorrect, and as only third statement is incorrect, the correct code for the given question will be option D. Further, the correct code for the previous year question is option B. Moving on to the next article of the day that has featured on page 6 of the Hindu, basically talks about the Jal Jeevan Mission or the Jal Jeevan Mission scheme. Now UPSC in the previous year has asked questions related to various government schemes that were in news, and thus this area becomes important for us from the perspective of prelims examination, as UPSC in 2016 asked a question related to the Atal Pension Yojana. So we can expect a question on similar line on the Jal Jeevan Mission. A practice question in this regard can be framed. The practice question here says, regarding Jal Jeevan Mission, which of the following statement is or are correct? The first statement here is, it aims to provide functional household tap connection to every rural household. Now this statement is correct. Basically, the Jal Jeevan Mission is launched by restructuring and subsuming the ongoing National Rural Drinking Water Program. And the aim is to provide tap connection to every rural household, that is Har Ghar Nal Se Jal, by the year of 2024. And the program or the mission will include water supply, creation of infrastructure at the village level, grey water management, technological intervention, reliable drinking water source, and the capacity building of various stakeholders that are involved under it. Moving on to the second statement, it says the goal of Jal Jeevan Mission is to provide functional household tap connection with service level at rate of 45 liters of water per capita per day. Now this statement is incorrect, as though the goal of Jal Jeevan Mission is to provide functional household tap connection, the rate of liters per capita per day is that of 55 liters and not the 45 liters. Moving on to the third statement, it says communities will contribute towards 10% of the capital cost in cash or kind or in labor in all the villages. Now this statement is also incorrect. Communities will contribute towards 10% of capital cost in cash, kind or labor, not in all the villages, because in hilly areas, forested areas and the villages having population more than 50% of SC or ST, the community contribution is reduced to that of 5%. Moving on with the question, it says select the correct answer using the code given below, and as only statement 1 is correct, the correct code for the given question is option A. Further, the correct code for the previous year question is option C. Moving on to the next article of the day that has featured on page 17 under the explained section of the Indian Express basically talks about the Office of Profit and the case against the Chief Minister of Jharkhand, Hemant Soren. Now UPSC under the polity section in the previous year has asked questions related to various things that were in news, and Office of Profit has been asked by UPSC in 2019 examination also, and thus we can expect a question on similar line on the Office of Profit, what constitutes Office of Profit and the basic nature of Office of Profit. A practice question in this regard can be framed. The practice question here says, which of the following statements are correct regarding Office of Profit? The first statement here is, the term has been defined under Constitution of India. Now this statement is incorrect, as there is no law that defines clearly that what constitutes an Office of Profit, and the definition has evolved over the years with the interpretations that are made in the various court judgments. This can also be solved if we have solved the previous year question, wherein the third statement here is also incorrect. Moving on to the second statement of the practice question, it says there is an upper limit on how many offices that can be exempted under the list. Now this statement is also incorrect, as there is no bar on how many offices that can be exempted under the purview of law, that is, that can be included under the Office of Profit list. Moving on to the third statement, it says the test for determining whether a person holds an Office of Profit is the test of appointment. Now this statement is correct. In 1964, the Supreme Court made a ruling wherein it concluded that the test for determining whether a person holds an Office of Profit is basically the test of appointment, and several factors are considered for this. For example, whether the government is the appointing authority. Secondly, whether the government has the power to terminate the appointment. Third, whether the government determines the remuneration. Fourth, what is the source of remuneration. And fifth, the power that comes with the position. All these factors were given as the reason behind the Supreme Court ruling as a test of appointment to determine whether an office qualifies as Office of Profit or not. Moving on with the question, it says select the correct answer using the code given below, and as only statement third is correct, the correct code for the given question will be option B. Further, we have already discussed that the third statement of the previous year question is incorrect, and thus the three options becomes invalid for us, and the correct code for the previous year question is option A. Moving on to the next article of the day that has featured on page 23 of the Indian Express, basically talks about the retail inflation which has risen to a new high. Now we have discussed in our previous discussion various questions on inflation. Today we will try to understand the various reasons behind the inflation, that is the demand pull, cost pull or supply side inflation methods. As UPSC in the previous year has asked questions related to demand pull inflation in the year 2021 only. A practice question thus in this regard can be framed. The practice question here says, with reference to the Indian economy, cost push inflation can be caused by which of the following? Now the first factor given here is that of expansionary policy. Now this is incorrect. We will first need to understand what basically is cost push inflation. Cost push inflation means that prices have been pushed up by increases in the cost of any of the four factors of production. The four factors of production here are labor, capital, land or entrepreneurship. Further, the price of raw material may also cause an increase in the total cost. This may occur because of a scarcity of raw materials in the market, an increase in the cost of labor to produce the raw material, or increase in the cost of import of raw material. The government may also increase the taxes to cover high fuel and the energy costs. This will ultimately force the company to allocate more resources to giving taxes, and in order to compensate for their losses, the increased cost is later passed on to the consumer, and this will cause a rise in the general price level or the inflation. So thus, scarcity of raw material causes cost push inflation. Another thing to understand about cost push inflation is that demand for the goods must be static. That means that the demand should remain constant while the supply of goods or services should decrease. One example of the cost push inflation can be taken by the oil crisis of 1970. In 1970, the price of oil was increased by the oil companies, while the demand for the oil remained the same. As the price continued to rise, the cost of finished goods also increased, which resulted in inflation globally. We have already discussed that increase in wages will also increase the cost of the final produce, which will be then transferred to consumer and thus will result in cost push inflation. Higher purchasing power, on the other hand, is an example of demand pull inflation and not cost push inflation. And we have already discussed that government may sometimes increase the taxes to cover high fuel and energy costs and thus will result in cost push inflation. The question further says select the correct answer using the code given below, and as only option 2, 3 and 5 are correct, the correct code for the given question will be option B. Further, the correct code for the previous year question is option A. Moving on to the last article of the day that is featured on page 10 of the Indian Express. This infographic basically highlights the ordinances over the years and says that 87 ordinances have been passed by the BJP since it came to power in 2014. Now, UPSC under the polity section previously has asked questions related to president and its power, and ordinance making power is also a power of the president. A question on ordinance making power of president in this regard can be framed and can be asked in the coming prelims examination. The practice question here says, which of the following statements are correct regarding the ordinance power of the president? The first statement here is, these ordinances have the same force and effect as an act of parliament and are permanent in nature. Now this statement is incorrect, as Article 123 of the Indian Constitution empowers the President to promulgate ordinances during the recess of Parliament. These ordinances have the same force and effect as an act of Parliament, but these are in nature of temporary laws and not of permanent nature. Moving on to the second statement, it says the decision of President to issue an ordinance can be questioned in a court. Now this statement is correct. In the Cooper case of 1970, the Supreme Court held that President's satisfaction can be questioned in a court on the ground of malefied. This means that the decision of the President to issue an ordinance can be questioned in a court on the ground that the President has prorogued one house or both the houses of the Parliament deliberately with a view to promulgate an ordinance on a controversial subject so as to bypass the parliamentary decision-making structure. And this will be going against the authority of the Parliament, and thus the decision of the President to issue an ordinance can be questioned in a court of law. Moving on to the third statement, it says it can modify or repeal any act of Parliament and can even amend the Constitution. Now this statement is incorrect. An ordinance, like any other legislation, can be retrospective and can also come into force from a back date. It can modify or repeal any act of the Parliament or any other ordinances. It can also alter or amend a tax law. However, ordinance cannot be used to amend the Constitution. The question further says, select the correct answer using the code given below. And as only statement 2 is correct, the correct code for the given question will be option B. Further, the correct code for the previous year question is option C.